The worst rated Far Cry in series history. To my surprise, that's a factual statement. I mean, I knew Far Cry 6 wasn't the best in the series by far, but I didn't realize its critical and fan reception were as bad as they are. A 73 on Metacritic for a series that's never dipped below 80 is essentially a far cry from its glory days. I just had to get that out of the way. What's even more jarring is the user score with only a 5.4. This is substantially lower than any of the previous entries. But why? Now, before you say, well, Far Cry New Dawn got a lower score, yes, that's true, but I wouldn't consider that a mainline title, so I'm not counting it here. Anyway, we know Far Cry 7 is somewhere on the horizon, even though it hasn't been officially announced or confirmed. But we can only hope that Ubisoft figures out whatever it is they need to get this series back on track. Now, depending on who you ask, it seems that Assassin's Creed Shadows was a step in the right direction, bringing back the focus on stealth and improving on it in impactful ways when playing as Naue. With Far Cry being probably the second most popular in Ubisoft's franchise lineup, you can bet a good amount of money that they have a lot of manpower directed towards their next release. But let me be honest for a moment here. I played through Far Cry 6 when it was originally released, and I didn't find it to be all that bad. But here's the thing, I never finished Far Cry 5, so I wasn't experiencing any of that franchise fatigue. I use the word fatigue for a reason, that reason being that many of the reviews that I read from critics and players alike was that the formula has pretty much gotten stale and the lack of innovation led to the game's ultimate downfall, as far as the critical reception goes at least. Anyway, I don't want this video to just be about why this game was worse than others. Instead, I wanted to revisit the game, take a look at it thoroughly, and discuss what's good, what's bad, and where the series simply needs to improve in order to get back on track. So this video is going to be everything I have to say about Far Cry 6. So Far Cry 6 is set on the fictional island of Yara, a dictator-run country located somewhere in the Caribbean that has developed a cure for cancer, or otherwise known as Viviro. Does any of that sound familiar? Well, it should, since the country is basically based on Cuba, a country that is stuck in a time capsule, and as you may or may not know, it had long been rumored that Cuba had a cure for cancer, but that's been since debunked. Anyway, my opinion on Yara is pretty neutral. I think we've seen Ubisoft use a lot of different locales, and there's really only so much you can do unless you eventually go to space or something. Far Cry 5 takes place in Montana in the American North, where the wildlife includes bears, moose, and deer, and Far Cry 4 takes place in what is basically the Himalayas. It only makes sense that they went with a more tropical vibe, even though that's not the first time the series has been there, but it had been a while since Far Cry 3. Either way, this setting was never an issue in my opinion. I think the whole island allows for some really picturesque and beautiful looking moments with sun rays shining through the dense forests, these large farmlands, and so much more. I'll talk about the open world and the design of it later on in the video. I'm going to get into all the different gameplay systems, both new and old, but first I want to talk about the game's main villain, President Anton Castillo, who is played by none other than Giancarlo Esposito, otherwise known as Gus Fring if you're a Breaking Bad fan. It's obviously well known that one of the main attractions of any Far Cry game is the villain, and in the pantheon of Far Cry villains, El Presidente is quite an enigma. Of course, Voss is what many would consider to be the pinnacle of the series. However, Joseph Seed and Pagan Min are up there in terms of being memorable antagonists as well. But where does Anton lie? He always has this calm demeanor about him, even though he's about to perform some heinous act, rarely ever loses his temper, and is more than willing to execute and enslave just about anyone who goes against his ideologies. He believes that any decision he makes is the right decision for the country, regardless of cost. He is a dictator and tyrant through and through, and he just has this intimidating air about him. One misstep or misspoken word and you can find yourself staring down the end of a barrel. But the thing about Anton is that there's a disconnect between him and the player. There isn't a direct line between Danny and Anton, the way there is between Pagan and AJ, for example. That takes away from the personal connection between the antagonist and the protagonist that the series is usually known for. I get that the story and premise is fairly different from previous entries in this series. This time around, you're working with the guerrilla group attempting to overthrow a whole country's dictatorship, freeing that very country from that grasp of a tyrant who enslaves the country's citizens just for the sake of producing medicine. Anton, however, on the other side has one goal, and that's to turn Yara into a paradise, sparing no expense on his way to achieve that goal, while also grooming his own son to become heir to the throne. The story is a lot more politically charged than what the norm is for the franchise, and honestly, it's not a bad direction to go in when it's done correctly. But in Far Cry 6, the way it's presented and the way it ultimately plays out just takes away from what makes these villains so memorable. I would have definitely liked to see Anton have a lot more screen time, because whenever he is on screen, he just takes over the whole scene, putting everyone around him on edge. Overall, I really did like Anton as a main villain, but I just needed to see more of him. I think his overall role in the game was a bit too sparse, and there was more focus on taking out his lieutenants and so on, which I'll get into that later. Anyway, that's the story. Now let's get into the game's various systems. One of the biggest criticisms about Far Cry 6 was its lack of innovation. Basically, it feels like it made more of a lateral move than a vertical leap in any real way. I think there are some solid additions that we'll very likely see the next Far Cry build on and expand with. However, the game also added systems that honestly weren't all that necessary, but I'll start with what I think is good. And that starts with the Bandido operations. So this is something this series has never seen before. Sure, in previous Far Cry games, you can have rebels assist you in combat or hire specialists, but there was never a whole management system to it the way Far Cry 6 has implemented. It's a small addition and something that is completely passive for the most part. Essentially, what it ends up being is a slew of menu systems that allow you to send a group of bandits along with their leader to perform some operation that will reward you with some form of loot, which includes crafting material, a weapon, or just money. Your role in all this is to decide what your group of bandits should do given a certain scenario. Each time you do advance an operation, you're presented with 3 options. These 3 options are presented with a level of risk and reward. You can completely fail an operation and lose out on your soldiers if your odds of success fall low enough. Again, this system is relatively simple, but it's a nice addition that lets you pick and choose what rewards you want and what you're willing to put at stake. Each leader in your bandit group have some perks associated with them, and certain operations leverage those perks, making so that your odds of having a successful operation is increased by quite a bit. I think, and I also hope, this is something that we'll see expanded on in Far Cry 7. I know we don't have much to go on yet, but depending on what direction the next game goes in, I think this would be a great system to build on, allowing for more branching choices and potentially even seeing your choices play out in real time. Overall, I was a fan of the Bandido operation system, despite it being such a small portion of the overall game. Anyway, let's move on. Another major system that saw a pretty noticeable shift in Far Cry 6 was the addition of the loadout and gear system. In previous entries, your gear progression was tied more closely to the story. Your unlocks were typically based on in-world purchases or skill tree progression. But in Far Cry 6, Ubisoft decided to revamp the whole thing by introducing a loot and gear-based loadout system. It's a pretty significant change that at times can make the game feel more like a looter than what is the traditional Far Cry experience. Instead of simply upgrading a few weapons or unlocking skills, you now have different armor sets that offer perks like reducing fire damage, improving stealth movement, or increasing damage against certain enemy types. Each piece of gear has its own stats and bonuses, and of course you can mix and match them depending on how you want to approach a mission. Now on paper, this sounds like a big step forward. It gives players more control and lets you fine-tune your character to your preferred playstyle. If you want to play more stealthy, then there will be a gear set for that. If you want to just run and gun, you'll find items that complement that playstyle as well. The problem is that the execution doesn't always land. The gear system can feel bloated at times, especially when you're constantly picking up new items that don't particularly feel meaningful or game-changing from one another. What I did like, however, was the ability to modify a weapon how you see fit. Now, it's worth mentioning that this applies only to non-unique weapons, as the unique ones have their properties set in stone. For non-unique weapons, you can craft different ammo types, scopes, and various mods to increase damage, reload speed, and so on. I think the framework for something really good is there. It just needs to be further refined to really flesh it out. Ubisoft, for whatever reason, has had an obsession with turning all their games into loot fests, and depending on what type of gamer you are, this can either be a good thing or a bad thing. We even saw a loot system invade Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and we know how badly that went. Spoiler alert, they eventually made its whole loot system an optional thing rather than a core mechanic. I think the system in Far Cry 6, however, is just largely unneeded. It's not like the enemies you go up against have such unique differences about them that they require a well thought out build to defeat. Most enemies can be taken down with either armor piercing rounds or soft target rounds, but like even that isn't very important once your weapons deal enough damage. The whole build crafting system feels pretty shoehorned in for the sake of saying they added something new to the game that ultimately just wasn't needed. There are really only two directions Ubi can go in Far Cry 7. That's either expand on this build crafting system substantially, which I think would be a bad idea as it's never been a part of Far Cry's DNA to begin with, or wipe it out completely and stick with Far Cry 5's weapon customization and skilled loadout system that was fairly well received. Another system that's worth talking about is the camp facility system. It's not something that gets a ton of attention when people talk about Far Cry 6, but I think it's actually one of the more underrated features that the game introduced. Throughout the game, you're able to establish and upgrade various guerrilla camps scattered across Yara. Each of these camps have multiple facility slots that you can use to build specific upgrade stations. These are things like hideout networks, the guerrilla garrison, and the Bandido's barracks. What's smart about this system is how it ties directly into both your moment-to-moment gameplay and, of course, your long-term progression. Each facility serves a different function, whether that's unlocking fast travel hideouts across the map, which I found very useful, or giving you access to better gear and weapons, or even improving the Bandido's operation system that I just talked about. It's also a subtle yet somewhat effective way to reinforce the game's narrative. You're not just some lone wolf who is working to take down a dictator. You're helping outfit camps, strengthen your resistance, and giving your allies all the tools they need to fight back as well. Overall, I do think this is a solid addition and can definitely be built upon. We've even seen the most Assassin's Creed release have a similar system with its hideout implementation. Given that this system already exists, it will definitely be interesting to see how it's expanded on in Far Cry 7, if at all. Another thing that Far Cry 6 brought back, which I think was actually a smart move, was the use of a fully voiced protagonist. In this game, you play as Danny Rojas. You can, of course, choose between male or female versions of the character, both of which are fully voiced. This is a shift back from Far Cry 5, where the protagonist was completely silent. Now, I get why Ubisoft went that route in Far Cry 5. It was probably to let players feel like they're stepping into the shoes of the character and play the role out themselves without having any preconceived notions about the character's personality. But in practice, I just feel like it kind of backfired. I think giving Danny a voice just helps the story feel a bit more cohesive. That doesn't mean everything that Danny says is perfect, but at least there's a character there with a voice, with opinions and reactions to what's happening around them. I'd honestly be surprised if the next game went back to a silent lead. However, with that being said, I also wouldn't be surprised if the next Far Cry had some sort of extensive character customization to complement its build system that I mentioned before. Okay, so I've talked about a bunch of new and refined systems, but where exactly does the fatigue set in? At the beginning of the video, I mentioned how that was one of the key aspects as to why the game was received so poorly. Well, in my opinion, it's most evident in the mission design. From the jump, the game has you go into FND bases and either eliminating a high value target, disabling some anti-aircraft weaponry, or destroying both the tobacco fields and the storage units for the Viviro product. I'd say you do all that within the first hour or so of the game, and the first island that you're on essentially serves as a tutorial island before the game lets you actually start exploring Yara freely. But the thing about these different missions is that no matter which lieutenant you're trying to take down, or which portion of the island you're doing your missions in, the actual mission objectives get pretty boring quickly. Clear this checkpoint, destroy this weapon, ambush this target, then rinse and repeat. This problem has existed for just about every Ubisoft open world game, and I feel like Far Cry 6 was one of the worst offenders of this. It can definitely get exhausting doing the same thing over and over and over again, given that the campaign length in Far Cry 6 is close to 25 hours. That's kind of when you get to the point where you just want to get this over with. Mission variety has to be atop of the list of things that Far Cry 7 just simply has to improve on. There needs to be more creativity in how missions can be approached, how missions can play out, and what the mission asks the player to do. I will say, however, that Ubisoft games and the Far Cry series in general are all about creating your own fun. If you just go in, kill everyone on a base, then complete the mission, then yeah, you can obviously get bored pretty quickly. If, however, you approach with a strategy in mind, maybe you want to pull off some crazy stunt like stealing the enemy's tanks and causing havoc, or you want to stealth around like an assassin or a sniper, that's all possible. I guess whether or not you get bored or really feel any of that fatigue comes down to how creative you're willing to get. Now, the open world in general has no shortage of activities to do, and I mean that literally. Ubi has always done a good job in providing a player with things to do. The quality of whatever that thing might be is, of course, always up for debate. But regardless of that, you will always have something to distract you in between the main missions. Far Cry 6 has all the bells and whistles we've seen in other titles: hunting, fishing, looking for treasure, completing side missions, and so on. The list is absolutely massive, and Yara is a beautiful place to complete all of these side activities in. The scale of the island is absolutely massive. In fact, if you just make a beeline for the main story missions, you'll probably only explore half of the entire island. The design is typical Ubisoft, and I mean that in a good way. I've always held the opinion that Ubi does a great job in its environmental and level design, and this game is no different. There is a ton of attention to detail, and the various regions have a lot of distinctions between them. You'll go from lush jungles to dense forests to even urban areas and whole fleshed out cities like Esperanza, for example. The varied regions do help in keeping the game fresh during its main story runtime. Now, if only the mission variety was as different as the regions that you play them in. Anyway, I want to wrap this video up before it goes on for too long. My overall thoughts on Far Cry 6 are pretty simple. It's a game that attempts to introduce new systems to an already established formula, but misses on its execution of adding any real value or any impact. It doesn't change up the core formula in its mission design, and that sense of been here, done that is just all too strong in Far Cry 6. The story attempts to be one that's played out on a much grander scale, putting an end to a country's tyrannical regime and freeing the citizens of oppression, but this grander scale just creates a disconnect between the main villain and the protagonist that we've just come to know and expect from this franchise. The open world, however, is gorgeous as ever, and as per usual, there's no shortage of things to pull you away from that main story at any given moment. But overall, the game just feels way too familiar, and its lack of innovation is a huge issue. They just can't keep doing the same thing over and over again, and Ubisoft eventually needs to learn how to expand this open world and create new ways to engage with it. I'm very interested in seeing what Ubisoft will have in store for us in the next iteration, but it's clear that the areas they need to focus in will be redefining the formula completely. So with that being said, I want your opinion on Far Cry 6. Let me know what you guys think about it. Did you guys like it? Did you guys not like it? So thank you guys for watching. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you're new here, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.